Nike has never been a shoe company. That's the thing. Almost nobody realizes when they look at that swoosh, the most recognized logo on the planet, designed in an afternoon for $35 by a college student whose name most people couldn't tell you. A slogan that came from a death row execution. A shoe that supposedly got Michael Jordan banned from the NBA, except it probably wasn't even the shoe everyone thinks it was. A company that nearly went bankrupt multiple times, got caught lying about its athletes, and got caught exploiting the people who made its products, and still somehow became the world's dominant sports brand, worth tens of billions of dollars today. The real story of how that happened has almost nothing to do with better shoes. It has everything to do with something far more powerful than any product. And once you see it, you'll never look at a pair of Nikes the same way again. Picture this. It's 1964. A young guy with a beat-up car pulls into a parking lot at a track meet somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. He pops his trunk, lays out a few pairs of running shoes on a folding table and starts selling them to athletes one by one. No store, no brand, no logo. Just a guy, a car, and a stack of shoes he didn't even make. That guy is Phil Knight. And that trunk is where the world's biggest sports brand was born. Now, here's what I want you to think about as we go through this story. Almost everything you think you know about how Nike got to where it is today is wrong. The name was a last-minute compromise. The logo was almost rejected. The most famous slogan in advertising history came from a murderer on death row. And the shoe that supposedly got Michael Jordan banned from the NBA, it probably wasn't even the shoe everyone thinks it was. This is the real story of Nike, not the clean, inspirational founder's vision version they sell you on the website. The actual story, full of betrayal, near bankruptcy, accidental inventions, and some of the most calculated psychological manipulation in business history. And by the time we get to the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Nike doesn't sell shoes. It never did. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is not what anyone expects. In January 1964, Phil Knight, a mid-distance runner and accounting grad from the University of Oregon, sat down with his old college coach Bill Bowerman, and they formed a company on a literal handshake. Between them, they had $1,200. They weren't designing shoes. They weren't manufacturing anything. They were importing Japanese running shoes from a company called Onitsuka Tiger and reselling them out of Knight's car at track meets. That's it. Two guys, a supplier relationship, and zero brand identity of their own. And here's why that matters so much. Most people assume Nike started as an innovation story, a visionary founder with a revolutionary product who just needed the world to catch up. But the real first chapter is a distribution hustle. Blue Ribbon Sports, which is what they called themselves, was a reseller. And that gap between being a reseller and being a creator is the tension that drives everything that comes next, because that reseller relationship is exactly what almost wiped them out. By the early 1970s, Blue Ribbon Sports had grown into a real business. They had employees, they had sales, and they were still under exclusive contract to distribute Onitsuka Tiger shoes across the United States. But behind the scenes, Onitsuka was quietly negotiating with other American distributors. The plan was to either cut Blue Ribbon out entirely or force a buyout and take majority control. Knight found out, and instead of playing it straight, he did the same thing right back. He started secretly designing and manufacturing his own shoes while still technically operating as Onitsuka's partner. When the truth came out on both sides, lawsuits flew in both directions. Now, they needed a brand name, and they needed it fast. Production deadlines were closing in. Knight's personal preference for the new brand was, I kid you not, Dimension 6. His team hated it. Then Jeff Johnson, the company's very first full-time employee, called at 5 in the morning saying a name had come to him in a dream. Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Knight reluctantly agreed, mostly because they were completely out of time. So, the name that is now one of the most recognized words on the planet was a last-minute compromise that the founder didn't even love. And keep that pattern in mind, because it's about to repeat itself, with the logo, with the slogan, with almost every cultural asset Nike has ever owned. But before we get there, there's something you need to understand about what this breakup from Onitsuka actually meant for the company, because it nearly killed them. Through the 1970s, Nike was growing so fast it was constantly running out of money. Phil Knight later described it as living on the float, surviving by timing bank transfers down to the exact day. Then, in spring 1975, things became genuinely critical. Nike's bank pulled its entire $1 million line of credit. The company was $75,000 short of a required payment to its Japanese trading partner, and Knight and his executives drained their own personal bank accounts just to cover it. A foreign trading company called Nisho Iwai ultimately stepped in, paid off Nike's debt to the bank, and became the financial backstop that kept the whole operation alive. Think about that for a second. This is years before Air Jordans, years before Just Do It. A company most people have never heard of is arguably as responsible for Nike's survival as any shoe design or marketing campaign. One bad month and Nike is gone. There is no swoosh. There is no empire. Just a closed business and a cautionary tale. Now, while Knight was fighting for cash, Bowerman was in his kitchen fighting a completely different battle. And what he stumbled onto there is one of the most famous accidents in product history. In 1970, Bill Bowerman was sitting at breakfast, staring at his waffle iron, and he had an idea. What if he inverted that grid pattern into a rubber sole? Traction without metal spikes. He poured melted urethane into his wife's waffle iron. His first attempt failed completely. He forgot to add a release agent and the iron sealed shut. Ruined. He kept going anyway, and the resulting waffle trainer became one of the most important innovations in running shoe history, debuted just in time for the 1972 US Olympic trials. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. To promote the new shoes at those trials, Knight publicly claimed that 4 of the top 7 finishers in the marathon had worn Nikes. In reality, the first 3 finishers wore West German Adidas. It was a deliberate stretch of the truth, and it worked, because it made Nike sound like it was already winning against the giants before it actually was. And right there, in that single moment, you can see the seed of Nike's entire marketing DNA. The technical innovation came from a waffle iron and a ruined kitchen appliance. The story that sold it was a calculated bluff. Nike understood from almost the very beginning that the narrative around a product can matter more than the literal facts behind it. That is not an accident. That is a strategy. So now you have the name, you have a product, and you have a philosophy. What you don't have yet is the logo. And the story of how Nike got its logo is almost too strange to believe. In 1971, with production deadlines closing in, Knight needed a logo. Carolyn Davidson was a graphic design student at Portland State University when Knight hired her. She was paid $2 an hour for her work for a grand total of only $35. She gave him 5 different designs, one of which was the swoosh, which resembles a wing and hints at Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Knight settled on it, saying at the time that he didn't love it, but maybe it would grow on him. That is the entire origin story of the most recognized logo in sports. Years later, Knight threw Davidson a private party and presented her with an envelope containing 500 shares of Nike stock, then worth about 17 cents per share. After stock splits bringing the total to 32,000 shares, those shares were worth about $3 million. A $35 invoice that turned into a multi-million-dollar gift, because the logo nobody was excited about became a symbol people tattoo on their bodies, and by the mid-1990s Nike could confidently drop the word Nike altogether and let the swoosh speak for itself. The checkmark was so well known it didn't need a name attached to it anymore. Now, we need to talk about Michael Jordan, because this is where Nike stopped being a shoe company and started being a cultural force, and the story behind it is messier than the legend suggests. When Jordan entered the NBA in 1984, the league had a rule requiring shoes to match team colors and be mostly white. In October 1984, Jordan wore a black and red shoe that broke this rule. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't the now famous Air Jordan 1, it was an existing Nike model called the Airship, mocked up in Jordan's color scheme because the real Air Jordan 1 wasn't ready yet. The NBA sent Nike a formal letter in early 1985 prohibiting the shoes. Nike ran with the controversy anyway. They built ads showing the shoes with a censor bar, implying they'd been banned. The popular story says Jordan was fined $5,000 every game he wore them, and Nike happily paid it as a marketing cost. But there's no verified footage of Jordan actually wearing the so-called banned colorway Air Jordan 1 in a real game. He mostly wore league-approved colorways afterward. The fine story is almost certainly exaggerated and may never have happened the way it's been told. But here's the thing. None of that matters because Nike didn't just capitalize on a rule violation. It manufactured a legend around a shoe that technically was never the one that got banned, and that legend sold millions of pairs. Rebellion sells better than compliance. Nike knew that in 1985, and it still knows it today. And speaking of manufactured legends, we need to talk about the most famous slogan in advertising history, because where it actually came from is something Nike buried so deep that most people still don't know it. In 1988, an ad executive named Dan Whedon needed a single line to unify a batch of unrelated Nike commercials before a client presentation. He drew inspiration from an unlikely and genuinely dark source. Gary Gilmore, a convicted double murderer executed by firing squad in Utah in 1977. When asked for his last words before the execution, witnesses say Gilmore said, "Let's do it." Whedon didn't like "let's," so he changed it to "just do it." And he never told Nike where the phrase actually came from. Phil Knight, who was famously skeptical of advertising in general, reportedly dismissed the idea at first before Whedon convinced him to trust the campaign. Almost every person watching this video has heard "just do it" thousands of times. Almost none of them know it came from a death row execution. Nike built a message about willpower and self-belief from a phrase spoken facing a firing squad and buried that origin so completely that it became one of the most wholesome cultural mantras in the world. That is not luck. That is a level of brand control that is almost impossible to overstate. So by the late 80s and into the 90s, Nike's storytelling machine was working perfectly on the outside. But behind the factories that made the shoes, a very different story was about to become public. And this one nearly destroyed everything. Through the 1990s, labor and human rights activists accused Nike of running sweatshops across Indonesia, Vietnam and China, with reports of extremely low wages, forced overtime, and unsafe working conditions. Nike's initial response was to treat it as a public relations problem to manage rather than a real issue to fix. Protests began outside Niketown stores, sales took a hit. The brand, that had spent decades carefully crafting an image of aspiration and rebellion, was suddenly the villain in a global conversation about exploitation. The turning point came in May 1998 when Knight gave a landmark speech publicly admitting that the Nike product had become associated with harsh labor conditions and pledged real reforms. Raising the minimum working age, adopting cleaner standards in factories, dramatically increasing monitoring. Nike went on to help found the Fair Labor Association in 1999 and by 2005 became the first company in its industry to publicly release its full list of contract factories, which pressured competitors to follow. This is the ethical hinge of the whole story. The company that built its brand on controlled narratives finally had a narrative it couldn't control. And the way it responded, slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately with real structural change, is what allowed it to rebuild the public trust it needed to keep growing. And once that trust was rebuilt, Nike doubled down on something it had always quietly understood. Something that explains every single story we've told in this video. Nike doesn't sell shoes. It never did. One of Nike's earliest employees, Jeff Johnson, is often credited with a line that became an internal philosophy. Nike doesn't sell shoes, it sells dreams. And you can see that philosophy working in two very specific ways. First, Nike ads almost never lead with cushioning technology or material specs. They lead with emotion, struggle, identity, the version of yourself you want to become. They let you buy into a story about who you are, not a product description. Second, from the banned Jordans onward, Nike has repeatedly used limited releases, exclusive colorways, and hype-driven drops to trigger what psychologists call loss aversion. The human tendency to want something more intensely the moment it might disappear. Sneaker resale culture, the lines around the block, the bots crashing websites, that entire ecosystem is, in large part, a byproduct of scarcity that Nike engineers deliberately. And when you look back at everything we've covered, the waffle iron myth, the banned shoe, the murderer's slogan, the $35 logo, you realize they're all the same move. Control the narrative. Create desire through scarcity or rebellion. Make the customer feel like they're part of something bigger than a transaction. Now, if you've made it this far and you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, I'd genuinely love to know. Which part surprised you the most?
Drop it in the comments below because I read them and the conversations that happen down there are honestly some of the best on this
And if you
channel.
want to see more stories like this, the real, unfiltered history behind the brands and companies that shape the world, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what's coming next. Now, let's close this where we started. As of mid-July 2026, Nike's market cap sits at over $65 billion, placing it at number 1 among the largest sportswear companies by market value. Non-US markets now bring in 57% of the company's revenue, and Nike stands as one of the most well-known sneaker brands in the United States. All of that, every dollar, every athlete partnership, every cultural moment traces back to a guy selling shoes out of a car trunk at a track meet in the Pacific Northwest with $1,200 and a handshake. But here's what I want you to take away from this story, because it's bigger than Nike. Almost nothing about this rise was inevitable. The name was an accident, the logo was an afterthought. The slogan came from a death row cell. The company nearly went bankrupt multiple times. It got caught lying about its athletes. It got caught exploiting its workers. And every single time the truth threatened to catch up with the story, Nike found a way to rewrite the story. That is not a lesson about shoes. That is a lesson about narrative, about the terrifying, almost unlimited power of controlling the story people tell about you. Nike didn't build a better shoe than everyone else. It built a better story, and it kept rewriting that story every time the facts got in the way. The trunk is still there if you look closely enough. It's just worth $65 billion now.